Hello, welcome in and welcome back, Notre Dame fans, to another episode of the Under the Dome podcast. This time, kind of a little bit of a spur of the moment live broadcast following Notre Dame's interesting win at Florida State last evening. In case you've been under a rock, Notre Dame barely survived and won against Florida State in a hostile environment and an environment that I was impressed with, given the way that Florida State has been over the last couple of years. Notre Dame was able to pull out a overtime victory, 41-38. And so we're going to kind of dive into some of those things moving forward. Like I say, this is a spur of the moment. I'm sitting around the Labor Day edition of this podcast. So all that said, let's just quickly get some of the particulars out of the way, and then we can kind of get to some, other things that I want to talk about briefly and see if we can get some other listeners in here to participate as well. First of all, this is the Under the Dome podcast. If you're new here, we're everywhere that you can find podcasts. We are on YouTube, so that's probably where some of you are watching right now. At least I hope. YouTube, you can find us all over the audio streams of Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, many more. If you're finding us on those platforms, make sure that you're either clicking that follow button, or you're subscribing, or doing whatever it takes so that when we do these live stream things, you can get those notifications that we're going live, and you can come on, you can participate. And like I say, I always really have made it a goal, and we're getting closer to being able to do some more of these things to make this a pretty interactive type of a podcast. So if you're joining us, we really appreciate you. Want to talk about Notre Dame, Florida State, and like I say, hopefully at some point we can get a little bit of audience participation. So if you got something that you want to say and you're listening here live, make sure that you either type it in the comments or tweet me or whatever the situation is, that your voice can be heard on this podcast. Also, if I'm up for it here in a second, I'll throw a number up and we might take some calls here, but that's always I don't know. That's a big promise to make. And so I'm going to ramble for a little bit. If you've got things that you want to add, make sure you hit it in the comments. We'll make sure we touch on those, and we'll sort of see what we're doing going forward here. But anyway, Notre Dame, Florida State. There's a lot of things that I could do to start here. Let me first say that, like I say, I kind of mentioned this already, but this is really a spur of the moment type of a thing. I don't really even have the same audio equipment and things that I normally use when I record this podcast. I'm not in the same place that I usually record podcasts from. Like I say, I'm sitting around here. It's Labor Day and not really doing a whole awful lot, thinking a lot about Notre Dame. And I said, I might as well jump on a live stream and sort of just see what there is to talk about and what people are thinking about and about this game from last night. So bear with me a little bit. I'm kind of coming at this without much of a script. So the first thing, I guess, that I want to make this point right off the top is this. I know that there's a lot of the day after games knee-jerk reactions that come from a game like this, especially when you've got a fan base like Notre Dame's that seems to be rather reactionary, rather, I don't know, just a whole bunch of knee-jerk reactions. And I totally understand that. And there's, sometimes I have to be cognizant of what I say on Twitter, things especially that I reply to people on Twitter, because, I've at least to a certain degree learned to kind of even myself out during Notre Dame games in terms of, there's a certain script that I think that we've all become accustomed to in terms of, being Notre Dame fans, those that watch Notre Dame on a regular basis. And I got to be, I can't fall into the trap of just being too reactionary, I guess. That said, it has been over 12 hours now since Notre Dame and Florida State wrapped up last evening. And I think I've sort of calmed down from some of the things that I'm about to say. Here's what I will say to start off. Then I've teased this long enough. And I'm sorry that I'm rambling a little bit. Like I say, we're going without a script here today. So I'm not sure that what you saw out of Notre Dame last night is particularly, and I don't know, definitively an indication of what you're going to see from Notre Dame the rest of the season. And here's what I mean by that. Obviously, from, the beginning of time, we've seen teams that, looked like college football national championship type of contenders look like they didn't know what they were doing in the early weeks of the college football season. And we've also seen teams that, absolutely blew the brakes off of teams in the first couple weeks of the college football season look really poor as the season went on. So, to a certain extent, I think we all have to realize that it's one game. Okay, it was one game that obviously didn't exactly go how Notre Dame fans wanted it to go, in terms of you wanted a dominating performance against a team like Florida State, against a team that's not very that historically hasn't been very good. However, I think we can all agree that the Florida State team that we saw play against Notre Dame last night has not been the Florida State team that we've seen play against Notre Dame in prior years. I feel like that's safe to say. They have certainly, quite a few transfers from guys who were 4 and 5 stars players coming out of high school. I think the broadcast mentioned that they had something like 11 graduate transfers to kind of help sort of stem the tide just a little bit as they kind of, get a little bit back into the swing of things in terms of being a contender in the ACC and then upping recruiting again. And I think Florida State, frankly, is well on their way to doing that. I think that, I was very impressed with Florida State last night. And I think that the arrow is certainly pointing upward for them. In terms of how the game went, I got to be honest, that game for about 3 quarters went precisely how I thought it was going to. I was on record as saying that, I thought that it would be kind of a slower start. I thought that it was going to be a situation where Notre Dame and Florida State played pretty close throughout most of the first half. Notre Dame, opened it up in the third quarter. And, I said all these things prior to the game. It's the Notre Dame script that we've all really become accustomed to be honest with you. I mean, how many times have we seen that from Notre Dame? Just play down to your opponent a little bit, feel them out. And then when it comes to winning time, you win. Okay. And to a certain extent, that's exactly what happened. Now, I will say that going up 38-20 in the fourth quarter, not scoring the entire fourth quarter, and then, leaking like a sieve defensively for the most part through the fourth quarter was not what I anticipated. Once we hit 38-20, I sort of thought, well, okay, I sort of expect each team's going to score one more time and this game's going to be over. We're looking at like a 45-28 type of a game. And that's about what I never put a score prediction out there, but that's about what I expected. I expected Notre Dame to get to the, high 30s, low 40s. Florida State to, hit on a couple big plays like they did, and then that would be it. The concerning part, I guess, and we're going to dive into the defense here in just a little bit, but I guess the most concerning part of the defense is that we knew that the defense was going to look a little bit different. We knew that they were going to, if you listen to any of my podcasts before, I had Nick Shepkowski on prior to the Florida State game. And, he made a really great point. We talked about it at length on the first podcast that, or the last podcast rather, that Notre Dame was going to, likely give up some bigger plays, but because they were going to be more aggressive. But if that meant you were going to force a few more turnovers, if that meant you were going to, sack the quarterback a few more times, create some anxiety for the other team's offense, then that was fine. Create more opportunities for your offense. That was going to be something that we would have to live with. But we didn't expect Florida State to be able to drive the ball the way that they did. When you're thinking about defense, if a team hits on a couple big plays throughout the game and that's all they get and they can't really sustain drives, you live with that. Otherwise, you hope that, they have to, every time that they score, they have to go on a 10, 12 play drive to do it. And you hope that they kind of self-destruct. Well, here's the problem. Notre Dame gave up big plays and they gave up drives, which is a little bit concerning. So that's kind of my number one concern, is that it wasn't just the big plays that killed Notre Dame. They got to eliminate some of those at the very, very least. But it was also that they let Florida State drive the ball, especially throughout the second half. And so you can have one. 0 would be good, but you can't allow the other team to do both when it comes to just driving the football and giving up big plays, in my opinion. Before we dive really far into the hot button topics on the defense, I want to just reset here real quick. Like I say, if you're new here and I see I'm terrible with names and putting and pronouncing names, but we've got a couple comments that have come through. Thank you for listening. Hey, welcome here. Thanks for subscribing and all of that. Like I say, if you're new here, make sure you're hitting the subscribe button. Also, we're everywhere that you can find podcasts. If you just want to listen to the audio version, because I know not everybody wants to come in and listen to and come on to a live YouTube channel and do all of that all the time, and you can't stick around for the whole time. So if you can't do that, you can't commit to that. Make sure you go to Apple Podcasts, Google Play, all of that type of stuff. Also, my Twitter handle is on the screen if you are watching. It's @RealBBeldon. Wherever you're listening, if you want to find the other platforms, the easiest way to do that generally is to go to my Twitter, click the link in the bio there, and it will take you pretty much right exactly to any of those places. There's a nice little landing platform for that, so you can click wherever you want to go, and it's just very, very easily, whether you're on your phone or on a computer or what have you. So anyway, just wanted to get that out of the way. So let's flip back. I mentioned the defense a little bit. We're going to get back to them, but let's talk about the offensive side of the ball just a little bit. The interesting takeaway for me, and we're going to talk about individuals, but I guess the interesting takeaway for me, at least in terms of, the offense as a whole, is holy Moses, is this offense from Notre Dame just the absolute antithesis of what we came to expect from Notre Dame's offense last year. And I'm not really even saying that that's a good thing or a bad thing. I'm not really saying it's kind of an indifferent thing, and it's something that we're going to learn about as the season goes on. I mean, last year Notre Dame relied heavily on Kyren Williams. They relied on the run game. They relied on, controlling the tempo. They relied on a lot of those types of things. One thing that I was generally very excited about at the beginning of the game, at the very least, was the tempo at which Notre Dame was playing. And, I thought that was something, that I thought could be a staple of this Notre Dame offense is getting teams on their heels a little bit, using that momentum that they create by getting teams on their heels to force the tempo a little bit. And, early on we saw that and it looked really good. Now throughout the game, when certain things, there were some shaky moments for that Notre Dame offense. And, I think we kind of all expected that, especially in the first game of the season. However, those shaky moments kind of got them away out of their tempo a little bit. There were some missed assignments. There was a play in pass protection where, backup left tackle Michael Carmody doesn't even touch the defensive end, and he sacks Jack Cohn. There was some bad snaps. There was some things that got Notre Dame off of schedule a little bit. There were some dropped passes, notably, and all that away, Notre Dame, still scored 41 points. So, however, I think obviously the main thing that you look at when in terms of what you're concerned about for Notre Dame on the offensive side of the football was their inability to run the ball consistently. And, that's evidenced by Kyren Williams, 18 carries, 42 yards, a long of 7. Chris Tyree, 7 carries, 31 yards, a long of 12. And that wasn't for, neither of those guys do I think are at fault for that. by the way. There were actually a couple of times where I thought Kyron Williams, there's no way he's getting any yards on this carry. And then there he goes. He scores forward for 3-4 yards. And that's what having a good running back does for you. But, I just wasn't, real impressed with the Notre Dame running game. I wasn't really impressed with the plays that they called. Florida State, if there's one thing that you could say about Florida State and their defense is that they were fast and they were reactionary. And it just seemed like there were a lot of slow developing run plays for Notre Dame. Not every play is going to get you, more than 2 or 3 yards in the run game. But if you consistently get your pads north and south and get 3-4 yards, then that's solid for Notre Dame, especially considering what you're getting in the passing game, what you got in the passing game last night. But Notre Dame was it seemed like they were not consistently even getting past the line of scrimmage. And that's definitely something that, to a certain extent, I guess was expected. I wasn't expecting the offensive line to be a finished product on game one. However, I guess I sort of thought that, Notre Dame would have at least a little bit more success than what they did against a Florida State team that, generally, people weren't all that impressed with, to be honest with you. Now, watching last night's game, yes. I mean, I think that Florida State earned certainly what the praise that they will get for how they were able to kind of shut down Notre Dame's run game, the way that even though they gave up a total of 41 points, 38 through the first 3 quarters, they were able to buckle down when they needed to make some plays and do what they had to do to get that game into overtime. But, I will say that I do think it's kind of funny that if you listen to any Notre Dame podcast, if you listen to anybody on Twitter or on any social media platform, I think it's funny that people are talking about concerns about the offense in a game where Notre Dame scored a total of 41 points. I mean, that's just kind of crazy. So I'll sort of wrap that thought by saying, if the arrow can only point up for Notre Dame, that's really good. Nextly, I just want to talk a little bit about Jack Cohn. I don't want to say I got into it on Twitter. I don't really, I don't know. I try to keep myself pretty calm on Twitter these days and not go after too many people. But I will say that, there were a few people on Twitter as I scrolled through that had some things to say about Jack Cohn and his abilities or lack of abilities or whatever the situation might be. Here's what I'll say about Jack Cohn. I don't know how you can walk away from last night's game and really at any point in the game, with the exception of maybe one point in the first half where he looked like he was struggling just a teeny tiny little bit, and say anything negative about the way that Jack Cohn played or even insinuate that Jack Cohn should not be the starting quarterback for this Notre Dame football team. I mean, I'll be honest with you. When you look at Jack Cohn's stats, and stats don't tell the whole story, but 26 of 35, 366 yards, 4 touchdowns. He did throw 1 interception. However, that interception was a Hail Mary right there at the end of the first half that, hardly counts in my book. So it goes in the stat book as an interception, but in terms of do I care, not one iota. So, I don't know, frankly, what Notre Dame fans want from their quarterback other than what they got from Jack Cohn Sunday night in Tallahassee. I mean, I said, on a previous podcast, Notre Dame threw the ball for an average of 237 yards per game a season ago with Ian Book, who people were also mad at all the time, I might add. And then Jack Cohn comes in and just blows that out of the water in 3 quarters. Now, yes, were there times where the offense looked shaky? Yeah, certainly. I mean, they're snapping. I mean, our first round pick center is snapping the ball here and yon and not doing a shotgun snap when the quarterback is clearly in the shotgun. I mean, there were some errors there that really kind of, I don't know, that really were uncharacteristic errors that, as I talked about at the top of the show, got Notre Dame behind the sticks a few times and made things very difficult. But at the end of the day, if you look at the stats, Jack Cohn killed it. And here's the other thing, football largely is a momentum sport. Real sports are momentum based in general. It doesn't even have to just be football. I have to wonder how Jack Cohn looks and feels if on the second drive of the game, Michael Mayer doesn't drop that first down pass and Notre Dame at least kicks a field goal or maybe even goes in for another touchdown and goes up 2 scores. Then maybe some of that shakiness you see at the end of the first quarter, beginning of the second quarter before they kind of settled back in again, then maybe that's not something that you have to worry about anymore. Maybe Jack Cohn goes on to, maybe he doesn't throw it as much, but he's a little higher completion percentage. Maybe that opens up the running lanes. And I got to be honest, maybe then if Notre Dame doesn't give up huge plays on defense, then the running game gets going a little bit better. And so, the bottom line, I guess, is what I'm getting to is that I think the Notre Dame offense is just fine as long as they eliminate some of those errors that are just very, very easily correctable. And if they do that in this game, they go up 14-0 on Florida State, then I think you're talking about a game that just in all just goes way differently than, the way it did. Okay. Let's flip to the defensive side of the ball. And kind of as I do that, I'm going to go ahead and throw up a banner here that includes a call-in number that if you're listening or whatever, you can call in this number, 740-402-2021. That is not my personal cell phone number, I might add, but you will call it. I will be able to answer it. And if you've got something to say Notre Dame football-wise, hit that number. Also, if you're listening to the audio version of this later on in the day, feel free to call in that number. You can leave a voicemail on that number. And if you want your voice heard, the plan is to record at least one more podcast here before Saturday's game with Toledo. So, like I say, one more time, we're talking Notre Dame, Florida State pretty well exclusively here. We'll talk a little bit more. I mean, certainly we'll have other Florida State things to touch on because you could talk all day long about what happened against Florida State. And so I'm sure in the next podcast, which I hope will include my co-host, or at least recent co-host, Nick Shepkowski, I hope that we can get him on here, talk Notre Dame, Florida State, banter back and forth, and then touch on Toledo and Notre Dame moving forward. So if you've got things you want to say, by and large, 740-402-2021, you will hear your voice on the Notre Dame Under the Dome football podcast. So feel free to call that number. And we'll see. Like I say, I don't have my normal equipment here, so we're going old school. So if you call in, I'm just putting you on speakerphone and holding you up to the microphone. So, kind of playing here without all my weapons at my disposal. But also, if you got anything that you want to add, make sure that you leave it in the comments. We've had a couple comments. Thanks for those. If you got anything to say, anything you want to talk about, make sure you listen in the comments. We're hoping to get more listeners, hoping to get the subscribers up so that when we do these lives, more people drop in and talk and have their voice heard as well. So anyway, to the defensive side of the ball for Notre Dame, man, I don't know. Again, if you know anything about me, I've always been, I don't know. I see things through my Notre Dame green shaded glasses, meaning I've sort of been accused of being a homer when it comes to Notre Dame football, and that I always tend to look on the optimistic side of things and try not to be overreactionary. And I got to be real honest. That was sort of difficult at times for me when watching this Notre Dame defense last night. And again, like I say, I'll be honest and say that there were a lot of good things from Notre Dame players. I thought things that I liked. I saw that Notre Dame rotated defensive linemen in and out pretty well, and you never really noticed who was on the field unless you're like me and you were sitting there watching for specific players to get on the field. Every time it seemed like there was a different guy that was in the backfield. I thought especially Kurt Heinisch was getting a lot of defensive penetration. Jason and Justin Adamilola had great games, in my opinion. Quiet, great games, but games where, you noticed it seemed like each guy had a couple plays where maybe they didn't come up with a tackle or a sack, but you saw them get penetration and move the ball carrier, move the quarterback. And in all, I thought Notre Dame's defensive line was probably the best part of last night. But that said, there weren't enough of them on the field a lot of the time. A lot's been made thus far of the 3 down linemen, 3.5 if you call Isaiah Foskey a defensive end, although you might kind of call him more of a linebacker, that viper position that Notre Dame likes to call it, with then 4 other linebackers. I don't know what to make of this at this point. I'm sure, of course, in typical Notre Dame fan fashion, there were people online last night screaming for the firing of Marcus Freeman. Let's go back to Clark Lee, who, by the way, never mind. I'm just going to leave that alone. Let's go back to Clark Lee and bring Clark Lee back, or change the defense, or fire Marcus Freeman, or Brian Kelly needs to take over the defense, or this or that, or whatever. And I just got to tell you, I don't know what all goes into those decisions. I'm not a coach on the Notre Dame football staff, but I'll be honest and say, there were things that went on the Notre Dame defense that were good. There were things that were not so good. And number one, it's hard to evaluate a defense. And this is just kind of one of my takeaways. It's hard to truly evaluate a defense when the tackling in general is just so poor. And when I say evaluate the defense, I guess what I'm saying is evaluate it schematically. I mean, I think Notre Dame had an opportunity to make some more plays on defense. I mean, it felt like there were Notre Dame defensive linemen in the backfield on every single play. It's just there wasn't a whole lot of wrapping up and finishing the play. And what you thought was going to go for a 1 or 2 yard loss, was ended up being a play where, they wiggled out of the backfield and ran for 12, 13 yards. It felt like when it looked like Notre Dame was going to sack the quarterback, which it got to the quarterback a couple of times, I might add. Jordan Travis peels out of there and either runs for a big game, or I guess he didn't really hit a ton of completions down the field, but it just sort of felt like there were other sacks out there that could have happened when Notre Dame was just unable to finish the play. It just felt like they were so close to getting home from a standpoint of, they were right there, but just couldn't get off the block, or couldn't, Jordan Travis is pretty darn elusive and just couldn't bring him down. And there are a couple plays I know that happened because of that. So I don't know. Here's the general thing that I'll say. A lot of college football teams wanted Marcus Freeman to be their defensive coordinator, and we just have to remember at certain times, in my opinion, that teams know what they're doing. We think we know what we're talking about, and to a certain extent, some of us do and have a general idea, and there's varying levels of the schematics of defense in terms of the fans who watch Notre Dame football games. But even the most ardent fan, the most well-educated fan, the most football well-versed fan doesn't know what goes on in the coaches' meetings and what goes behind the decisions to do what Notre Dame does in terms of, that goes for the whole team, but specifically right now, I'm talking about on the defensive side of the football. That said, I don't know what went into the decision to go with 3 down linemen and dropping 8 a whole awful lot. It seems like we're, bringing 4 and dropping 7. It seemed like Notre Dame, and I haven't gone back and rewatched the game. I'd like to maybe go back and kind of chart this a little bit, but it just seemed like Notre Dame got pretty complacent or pretty, hey, let's let them run the football for 4 yards every time. Eventually they're going to run out of time and our offense is going to put a couple more points on the board. And so if we give up a long, 8-minute drive that ends up in a touchdown here, ultimately we still win the game. I think there was some of that kind of went on when it was 38-20. I don't think if you would have told Notre Dame coaching staff that it was going to be 38-20 to start the fourth quarter, I don't think anybody would have bet that Notre Dame goes into overtime still with 38 points. So I sort of think the thought was, okay, our offense is humming right now. We've got some good things going, and let's just let them run, move the chains a couple of times. If they score a touchdown, we're going to go ahead and have a nice response drive. And, if we trade touchdowns and field goals and all of that through the rest of the game, we win this game pretty easily. At least that's what I think. But again, like I say, gotta remember that Marcus Freeman is a guy that teams, not just Notre Dame, wanted. Okay. After one game, okay, first of all, Notre Dame, this isn't the NFL. Okay. You don't get a chance to try these things out where it's completely not harmless. You don't get a chance to just, against anybody else than your own team, see how certain things are going to work. And I think what Marcus Freeman has done and what has happened for this Notre Dame defense is that, came in with a plan. I'm betting that Marcus Freeman is well aware of the struggles and what didn't work and is going to go back to the drawing board and do things differently ahead of their game with Toledo on Saturday. I mean, I think that's just where we will evaluate Marcus Freeman as a coach is not after just one game against Florida State, against the team that sort of, I think it caught Notre Dame off guard a little bit. I think it caught anybody that watched the game last night off guard with how talented and how now it seems well put together they are. There wasn't any embarrassing, disjointed, lack of care, apatheticness to that Florida State team that we've seen in the past. And they put it together, and they put pretty much their best game together, in my opinion, that they've played in the last 3-4 years. And it still wasn't enough to beat Notre Dame. So where we are going to evaluate Marcus Freeman as a coach is how he adjusts to that. And I'm pretty confident that it's going to be a lot better. I'm pretty confident that, this conversation is not one that we're going to be having in 3-4 weeks for Notre Dame. I just think that, Notre Dame is going to find the right buttons to push defensively because the guys are there. Okay. The guys that you were worried about, the Cam Harts, the Clarence Lewises, those were not the guys that really was the issue. We weren't picked on in the passing game. It was really couple big plays, man-to-man. Houston Griffith got torched once, which is concerning. But, when you play a lot of man-to-man defense like Notre Dame wants to do, then that's going to happen. I'd venture to say that in situations where it's obvious passing downs, I don't think Notre Dame is going to do as much man-to-man as they continue to adjust this thing. But that's the point. There's going to be an adjustment period, and it's going to occur from week to week. And let's just sort of see where Marcus Freeman is, what we're talking about next week after Notre Dame demolishes Toledo, because I think that'll happen. And I think Toledo's a really good football team for a MAC school, but they're a MAC school. They're not going to be as good as Florida State. And I think Notre Dame's going to right some wrongs, and they're going to be playing at home, and Notre Dame's going to beat Toledo. So, I don't know. We'll see how this Notre Dame defense evolves. That's got to be the big thing, the big storyline is how Notre Dame evolves from what happened Saturday night. So, I guess my point here is that, I always say that the truth of things is somewhere in the middle. Okay. There were there are people that want to fire Marcus Freeman today, Labor Day, after the first game of the season. There are people that, at one point thought that Marcus Freeman was the second coming and was going to be the next Notre Dame head coach. And right now, I think the truth is somewhere in the middle, and that's that Marcus Freeman's a great recruiter, a really smart football coach, a guy that really cares about his guys, but is adjusting to a new job with new personnel with guys that he didn't recruit really. So let's give it a little bit of time before we burn the ship down is I guess what I'm trying to say. So I've rambled for a long time here. We've had, upwards of 4, 5, 6, 7 people at times during this live stream, and really, like I say, when I do these live streams, especially the spur of the moment ones, the goal is to invite more people on to listen to the podcast and to get more people that come on a regular basis, and so we're going to continue to do these at certain times, like I say, as we get more people and we get more consistent with it, now that we have a season to talk about, and when I'm able to bring on a few more guests and things, which requires a little bit of scheduling and planning for me, which I'm not always the best at. Like I say, I hope that these live streams become something fun for, the Notre Dame fan base to come to. So the plan, like I say, is, if you've listened to this live stream all the way through, I thank you. Thanks so much for sticking with us. Those of you that have stuck with us through the audio part, thank you as well. Make sure you're going to those different platforms. I can't stress that enough. Okay. Go to those different platforms. And the numbers help us do things better the next time, because, when the numbers are there, it is encouraging, and it helps me, do a couple things. Like I say, I really just kind of called an audible. I wasn't really planning on recording, and I'm like, you know what? I've got nothing to do for a couple minutes here, so let's record a podcast real quick. And do it live. So like I say, went without a script here for about the last 36 minutes. And so I thank those of you that have been here, that those of you that will tune in the next time after you hear this on the audio version, those of you that will tell a friend, like, hey, let's call in to Ben's show next week. So, and obviously we're going to do some cool things. So like I say, the plan is to do at least one more show this week before the Toledo game. You can count on at least an audio version of the show shortly after the Toledo game. I will be in attendance in South Bend for the home opener for that Toledo game. So if you're around, tweet me on Twitter, come say hi. I'll be all over the place, and love meeting other Notre Dame football fans. So if you're around, let me know. And if not, then we'll catch you another time. So if you listen this whole time, thanks. Check us out all over the web, iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, YouTube, all of that type of stuff. And until next time, go Irish.